So let me welcome all of you to this ninth session. This is our third year in Philosophers in the Midst of History. This is a quarterly series that we're doing here at the Frank Weinberg, partnering with them. And each year we look at one ancient thinker, one medieval thinker, somebody from the early modern period, so up to about the 1700s, 1800s maybe, and then a late modern thinker. So we've done a lot of people. In the ancient period, we've done Plato and Aristotle in previous years. And in this time, we're going to look at somebody who doesn't get a lot of press, unfortunately, and who I think actually deserves a good bit more, and that would be Marcus Tullius Cicero. I'll talk about this a little bit later. Some people don't consider him to be original enough to add to the philosophical canon. They would say, we should be looking at Epicurus or the Stoics or people like that. But I actually think he's a very important thinker. And he's had a great influence, and it fits in really well with the grand theme of this talk series, which is how philosophers have been formed by the times that they're living in and how they ended up having an influence on those times. And with Cicero, I think that's particularly the case because he is formed in the time that the Roman Republic is really starting to go to hell. And he's going to see the end of the Roman Republic and the rise of Julius Caesar, which takes place over quite a long time. He'll see the assassination. He ends up getting killed by one of Caesar's followers, or at least, followers of that follower, Mark Antony, and his men. And so there's that entire sort of political sequence there that's very interesting. But Cicero was also very important for bringing Greek philosophy into a Roman setting, into a Latin setting. And that would have massive effects on the Middle Ages, on early modernity. So he's a thinker that deserves to be looked at, and so he's formed by these things. He's reacting to these events, and he's also shaping the culture and the politics himself, and ultimately, dies. You could say playing the game of politics. So what I thought I would do is talk first a little bit about Cicero himself, just some general remarks. Then I wanted to look at, and I've given you what I hope to be a helpful timeline. I realize the print is a little small looking at it, but I wanted to pack. I didn't want to have 3 pages. I wanted to get it on 2 pages. I wanted to talk about his involvement in the Roman Republic and his connection with these other historical figures that we know about and talk about, and how he fits in there. And then I wanted to talk about his involvement in intellectual life and in his time. And then I wanted to talk about his continuing influence and why people are, in some respects, rediscovering him today, after a period where he'd been discounted for about 2 centuries. So what I'll do is, with these, I always just, present and I talk about the things. I've got a few notes here. We'll make a few references to the timeline. But, feel free to ask questions at any point or make comments. I'll always get us back on track. I should also mention, too, that there is going to be another Cicero-related event here in the Milwaukee area. We've just started a chapter of Sophia, which is the Society of Philosophers in America, which is devoted to doing events like this, doing public philosophy. And we decided that for our first event in March, and I'm not sure where it is yet, or that has to be determined, we would talk about Cicero's book on duties, which I'll mention during this talk, why you might be interested in it. So if that's something that you're keen on, you can talk to me afterwards, or if you go to our website, reasonio.com, you can see our calendar, and I'll be putting it in there. So enough of the plugging. What about this guy, Cicero? I'm sure all of you have seen the bust of Cicero, where he's got kind of wispy hair, kind of a dour face. That's the way he's typically presented. Cicero was in the senatorial class But he wasn't, one of the, we often hear about, the plebeians versus the patricians. There were other classes in between, and Cicero himself belonged to that. He was of a family of people who were sort of on the rise in Rome. And he got very involved in Roman politics. He did sort of the thing that we see our own politicians do. Let's say you wanted to be a politician here in Wisconsin, what would you do? First, you got to pick a party, right? So pick the Republicans or the Democrats, and now what do you do? There's a big part of it. As a matter of fact, in order to attain certain ranks, you had to have a certain amount of money, and Cicero's first wife brought a dowry that was just enough for one of those. So it was very convenient for him. So raise money. What else do you have to do?
Like if you name out there.
How do you do that?
In public talks, maybe. I don't know.
That's one way to do it. I mean, nowadays we would use social media. Yeah. You see, like a great example of this is Paul Ryan has these people who are gunning for him and trying to take that spot, and probably the one who's got the best chance is this Iron Stash guy, right? Because he's got a big public profile, and so you do that. And Cicero actually did write a piece on electioneering at one point, sort of like a dirty tricks manual. His pitch sort of like, here's the things to look out for with your opponents because politics is such a dirty business. But what else do you have to do? Like, let's say your goal was to become president one day. You don't just start running for president. I know some people do, but we dismiss them usually as kooks. What do you have to do? How do you start making your way up the ranks?
Start it locally, I guess.
Right.
Locally and then, yeah.
So you might start out with, the PTA, right? And then you start making a mark and people start to get to know you.
Whiteboard board. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, library boards are a good example. Foundations, you start to get to meet people. And then pretty soon somebody's like, you should run for state representative. And so you run, and then you make it. And then, better than that is being, say, senator. And then some people go from being state senator to going to the legislature at the national level, right? The Romans had something like that. They actually called it, they had a name for it, the cursus honorum, the path of honor. And so you would progress through these different things that, they've got kind of funny names, and each of them had a particular function. That's what Cicero did. That's what a lot of people did during that time. If you wanted to make your way up, you would do that. He was also a lawyer, too. A lot of what we have are his speeches for or against particular people. We have some letters about law cases that he was in. And some of his legal cases actually had major implications for Rome itself. So he had all of this stuff going on. He's born outside of Rome, actually a good ways from Rome. But you notice that in his biography, he very quickly winds up in Rome, because Rome was the place to be. And he starts studying, Greek, the Latin tongue, philosophy, rhetoric, law, literature. And he's residing, as was often the case, not with his own parents, but you can think of it as sort of like a couple-person boarding school. It was him and his brother with this guy, Lucius Crassus. And around that same time, we see there's some other people being born who are going to be important. Julius Caesar, Marcus Porcius Cato, somebody who would be kind of an ally of Cicero, somebody who Cicero certainly admired. And you see him moving his way up in the ranks. He starts his education in rhetoric and law under Scaevola, who is very important jurist. And then he goes to war, and he fights under Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo. When you hear about Pompey, Caesar and Pompey, the Pompey we're talking about there was the son of this guy, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, who Cicero is on the staff with. He's working under him. So all these people know each other. They're all connected in one way or another. And you see that, he goes to Rome, becomes a lawyer. He gets married. It's kind of a marriage of convenience. His wife brings a large dowry that offers a lot of opportunity. He goes off to Athens and to Rhodes to further his studies, also to evade the chance that he might get in trouble for one of the cases that he was prosecuting, which is kind of a smart thing to do. He only has 2 kids. His elder daughter is Tullia. She's born sometime when it looks like when he's away. He returns to Rome and he starts working his way up. Quaestor is sort of like when we have comptrollers for cities, the person who's in charge is kind of a boring job. A lot of people didn't take it that seriously in Roman history, actually. A lot of them didn't do a very good job. Cicero was very scrupulous, So he and actually Cato are great examples of this. They take these jobs, at their word and do the things that they're supposed to do that a lot of the people don't. And he's such a good guy at it that they actually ask him to prosecute the governor of Sicily, who's been misappropriating funds, and so Cicero does that. Then you see that he's appointed one of the aediles. These are another set of people. These are responsible for maintenance of public buildings and regulation of public festivals. They had broader powers that had to do with public order. What would we compare that to today? It's hard to say exactly. I guess something in the executive branch, And eventually he's appointed to praetor, which is another higher office, and these people would be given command of a garrison, or they might be sent out to other places. They presided over trials. It was a more important position. And then if you notice a little bit further on, he's going to become consul. And back in Rome, before the fall of the Republic, this is really the highest, well, it's not exactly the highest, because there could be extraordinary cases, but it's one of the highest executive functions that you're going to find. There were 2 consuls, and they had pretty broad power. And they were only elected for a year. So this is part of the Roman Republican government. And his year is a particularly tumultuous one. There's this Cataline Conspiracy that we'll talk about in just a moment. And you see that, there's a very important trial. And now we start getting into the sort of Roman history stuff as well. And if you look at in the second column where it's got the writings, you notice that almost everything before that is speeches. And those I just left in the Latin. The treatises, the things that we look at as philosophical works, those I gave you the English translation of. And he didn't write very many of them at first. He writes these later on. You notice towards the end of his life. He's going to die in 43. He'll actually be executed. He's caught, unfortunately, trying to flee and doesn't make it out. His son fortunately, does. But Cicero himself doesn't. What else should we say? He did have 2 marriages. And we know, nobody's quite sure exactly what was going on, but towards the end of his first marriage, he complained about her in some way betraying him. And there may have been some political things going on. Certainly their different family connections were already getting a bit strained because of the political situation. And so he divorces her, and he actually marries a younger woman, Publilia, who is officially his ward. And that doesn't last very long. And interestingly, why doesn't it last long? Because she is unsympathetic when his daughter dies. He's very close with his son. But I think you could say that he was even closer to his daughter, Tullia. She lived quite a long time. She and her mother actually went into mourning when Cicero went into exile. Arguably, she was probably on the same level as Cicero himself intellectually, which would have been fairly rare at that time. So, when she dies, it's a huge blow to him. And so his wife being unsympathetic, he did not go for that. He divorces her over that. And then just sort of continues on his own. And one of the reasons, I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the philosophy part, but one of the reasons why he does the philosophical writing, he tells us, is to ease his grief over the death of his daughter. So it's really quite a remarkable attachment that he's forming there. What we see often in ancient Greek and Roman history is women, having very subordinate roles and not having much of a place. That doesn't appear to have been the case in Cicero's household. So before we jump into the meteor history, how Rome went downhill, or if you're a partisan of Cicero and the empire, how they finally got things straightened out. Any questions or comments before I throw some more stuff at you? Well, let me sort of set the stage then. So you notice that the very beginning of that timeline, right? I began it the year before Cicero was born. This guy, Marius, is consul for the first time. And you probably remember Marius and Sola from world history. They were sort of rivals with each other. And they were in Rome. And Marius represented the more popular faction. And he was also kind of a, ambitious, some might say vain person himself. Certainly was willing to play fast and loose with the rules. He gets elected consul over and over again, and his reign is often quite bloody. Sola is a really militarily inclined, more conservative politician and commander who himself can be extraordinarily bloody-minded, but who does seem to have more of a wish to preserve the Republic. But it's sort of like, the Roman Republic, in many respects, is like a vase that's teetering. And every effort to try to get it, to stop teetering makes it teeter a bit more. Now imagine it's not just a vase that can fall off and crash, but it's also very delicate itself. So every place you touch it, it kind of crumbles in a little bit. You could say that's what was going on from about, the early 100s all the way through to the 40s in Roman history. So several generations of institutions being there, but crumbling, not being able to meet the needs of the Roman political community and the new situation that they were in. I mean, if you think about this time in history, what else is happening with Rome? What do you remember from, ancient history, or if you're watching some of these shows that they have on, they have a whole series now, about Rome. What else is going on?
Wars going on.
Yeah. Now, why are they fighting? Early on, what are the wars about? They're about survival. And then they become about hegemony over Italy. And then they become about survival again because, Carthage is going to destroy them if they don't destroy Carthage. Or Pyrrhus of Epirus, great king at that time, is also fighting Rome in Sicily. Once they get some breathing space, why are they fighting all these wars? I mean, it's expensive. Why do all that crazy stuff?
Create an empire.
Yeah. They expand. And there's something about this expansion, when you start expanding quickly, you scare the hell out of everybody else. And then they're often like, well, we need to take these Romans down. And so everybody was trying to do that at one point or another, and then the Romans would take them on. There were also, wandering barbarian tribes that would come in that had to be dealt with. The Gauls were a problem. They attacked Rome a couple times in the past. And then out east, you had these vast empires that are rising that you have to scrap with. This had been going on, and that created a great strain on Rome, in part because it brought in a lot of money and slaves, made people's fortunes overnight, which led to all sorts of economic dislocations. It also led to having these soldiers that you have to start, figuring out what you're going to do with after the campaigns are over. And it led to the rise of people who sometimes were quite unscrupulous and sometimes were thinking that they were doing things for the benefit of the whole. And you can see Marius and Sola as fitting in there. So what we see happening as this generation that's going to take part in the fall of the Roman Republic is being born are Marius and Sola scrapping with each other and their followers doing so within the Roman Empire while Rome is fighting everybody else and trying to conquer these different people. So there's a social war that takes place, and the social war is happening in the Roman Empire itself. It's called the social war because the Socii were the allies. These are the people who the Romans had conquered and given kind of rights to, but they weren't Roman citizens, and they wanted to be Roman citizens. They're like, well, why don't we have the same privileges as the rest of you guys? And so they fought. And then there's these wars with this king, Mithridates, who is on the rise in Asia. Kills Romans there, kills a tribune. That was a big deal. That'd be sort of like if we had a congressional delegation visiting, I don't know, say Sudan, and some warlord took over and then killed all those congressmen. That's about how serious it was. And so, these wars are going on. And at the same time, you've got this fighting between Marius and Sola, both of whom want to be the guy calling the shots. And you notice that around this time, so this would be when Cicero is beginning his education. Sola becomes consul. He invades Rome, and Marius flees into exile. Mithridates invades. Sola says, okay, I got to leave Marius alone for the time being. I'm going off to fight in the east. So that the empire, so there's actually still something to fight over when I come back. While he's doing that, Marius comes in, and his forces start killing people all over the place. As a matter of fact, according to some of the ancient sources, at one point in time, Marius would walk down the street, and if people would come up and they would greet him, and they would greet him with a lot of fear, because if he didn't give a greeting back, his followers would kill them. So there's all this reprisals and faction going on within Rome. And then Sulla comes back. And when Sulla comes back, he becomes dictator. The Romans had dictators before. A dictator is somebody who is appointed for a certain amount of time in an extraordinary crisis to create, public order or fight against the enemies. And Sulla's people also engaged in a lot of bloodletting. And Pompey was one of Sulla's lieutenants. So Pompey actually was at one point called the butcher of Sulla for all the things that were going on. And you see this sort of fighting going on. Sulla eventually is going to resign the dictatorship and reestablishes consular government because he wants the Roman Republic to continue. But like I mentioned, the vase is already halfway collapsed at this point. It's been crushed by Marius and Sola getting their grubby hands on it and squeezing it too tightly. And it's still wobbling back and forth. And outside forces are coming in to destabilize it even more. And you see these people, who've been raised now, coming up through the ranks, starting to assert themselves. Very strong personalities, let's call it. One of whom would be Pompey. Pompey was a man very driven by the desire to celebrate triumphs. A triumph was an honor that you would get when you fought in a war, as the general and conquered the enemy. He didn't seem to be particularly interested in having power just for its own sake. He was interested in what went with power. We also see Caesar rising at the same time. But there's other figures, on the rise. Some of whom are make these guys look particularly good, like Crassus, for example, who's going to take part in what we call the first triumvirate. Like you see here, we have all these things going on, right? The Spartacan uprising, I think all of you are familiar with that. Spartacus leads a number of slaves. They fought for about 2 years before Crassus finally defeats them. And that's what makes Crassus as a public figure. He's the richest man in Rome. He prosecutes this war that gives him public status. And we see these figures getting more and more power, either through wealth or through doing things or through a perception that they're the man who can get the job done. A great example of this that I have here in the chart is there's this Lex Gambina, and this gives Pompey special powers in any region within 50 miles of the Mediterranean Sea. Why? So he could fight pirates, because piracy was a big problem. And it wasn't just like going around with ships and finding the pirates and fighting them there. You would go to the pirates' lairs, or as we would, nowadays we call them rogue states, right? You'd go to the states that are allowing piracy and deal with them. This makes Pompey incredibly powerful. And so you've got all these figures kind of jockeying for position. Meanwhile, you have Cato and Cicero, probably two of the most publicly minded people on the rise. And then, what do we see? There's the Cataline Conspiracy. So I mentioned that I would talk about this a little bit more. This is essentially, what should we call it? An attempt to have a coup or a revolution against Rome. Cataline organizes a conspiracy that's centered on doing several things. One is assassinating Cicero, who is the consul at the time. Another is bringing in foreign armed forces and overthrowing the Roman Republic. And it's not exactly clear what they're going to do after that, because they never got that far. The conspiracy gets found out. Cicero procures a declaration of martial law and gives a number of speeches against Cataline, sort of listing what his followers are doing and denouncing his senatorial sympathizers, because he's got some people within the Senate backing him. So this is a real live, crisis at the time. And here's where it sets certain events in motion. It's an open question. What should you do with traitors? These are people who are planning on taking over Rome. Should you pardon them? Should you send them into exile? Should you kill them? What should you do? This is still a question we're facing today in our own politics. It's debatable about who exactly is a traitor and who isn't. But once somebody gets accused of something like that, you see, a lot of vehement denunciations coming out. So what ends up happening is the Senate was deliberating on what the punishment ought to be. And Caesar actually thought that life imprisonment in various Italian towns would be a good thing. Sort of like exile, but in Italy they'd be able to keep tabs on all these people. Cicero and Cato, both together, thought that you really have to root out the poison. And so they were for the death penalty. They ended up inflicting the death penalty without having a trial. And this would come to haunt Cicero later on. Because within a few years, one of his political rivals, who was at that time what was called the tribune for the plebs, the tribune for the people, enacts a law. And sometimes laws could be retroactive, we call it. We're not allowed to do this here in our country, thank God, but they would like enact laws, and then the law would have to bear on somebody that did something before. And so, it was declared that anybody who had killed a Roman citizen without a trial had to go into exile, which meant that Cicero then, and you see on the timeline, Cicero is forced into exile because of that. So that's kind of a setback. And it's not terrible for Cicero in certain respects because he gets to go to Greece and spend time, but it was very depressing for him. His house, his land is confiscated. His wife and daughter go into mourning. And he finally gets recalled from exile because this guy, Titus Annius Milo, is consul that year. And with Pompey's help, they bring him back. And then things start to get worse and worse. Now we've got all these different things going on, right? Pretty soon people start to think, what's going to keep order? So imagine that we're in a situation like that. What if we had, say, 10 different powerful personalities, or 12, or however many, and each of them has a following, and we do have some sort of institutions, but they're kind of using the institutions, some of them for their own gain or to jockey for position. What might be a good solution to that? How might we keep peace? Well, let me ask you this. When we see reality shows, what do they do in reality shows to try to give themselves an edge or to keep some sort of peace?
They vote them off the show.
Well, that's one thing. So you can kill your opponents, right? And voting off in this case means exile or death, right? It's not you go back to Indianapolis or whatever, and take up your life. What's that?
Form alliances.
Alliances, yeah, coalitions. And we think of, like Roman history in terms of these two major triumvirates, 3 men, rules. But Cicero actually had the chance to get in on the ground floor on the first one. Caesar comes to him and says, there's no reason it has to be a 3-man rule. It could be a 4-man rule. You, me, Pompey, who Caesar at this time is sort of on the outs with because he had, there was a marriage connection, and then that broke down. And Crassus, the richest man in Rome, who also, remember, crushed the Spartan revolution. We could rule together. Now think about how attractive this might be. If you don't do this, then in a way, by not giving your support, you're lending, some power to the forces of chaos. And look, the last 30 years has been, this process of, bloody revolts and, worrying about the barbarians out there and, factions and reprisals at home. Shouldn't you get in on this? Wouldn't that be the statesman-like thing to do? Wouldn't that be the way to serve the common good? This is the sort of thing. And Cicero writes letters to his friends saying, should I do this or shouldn't I do this? He's really weighing it, and he decides, no, I'm not going to become part of it. Cato wasn't even invited to it, apparently, because Cato is, the sort of stickler who he's going to do things the Republican way, and that's about it. As a matter of fact, when Cato was a kid, they said you got to watch him because Sola was in charge, and Cato said, why don't you give me a sword? I'll go kill him. I've got no problem with that. And then they're like, yeah, this kid we gotta keep an eye on him. But he thought Sola was doing things against the Republic. So what ends up happening? The triumvirate's going to break down, and when it does, part of how it breaks down, I'm going to jump over a lot of Roman history to do this. We'll say, you're all familiar with the crossing the Rubicon phrase, right? Caesar crossing the Rubicon was essentially a declaration of war. A declaration of war against who, though?
Rome.
Well, Caesar in a way is Rome.
But it was against the Republic.
Why? Why is it against the Republic?
Because it was Caesar claiming power for himself rather than for the triumvirate.
Yeah, the Senate were the ones who said, hey, you've been in Gaul, you conquered Gaul, thanks for that, but you've been ruling that basically as like the governor, building up military forces, doing God knows what over there for years and years and years. What the hell's going on? You need to come over here and give an accounting, And Caesar's like, well, if I do that, they're probably not going to like what I have to say. And they told him too, you need to leave your armies behind. Just you as a citizen need to come in. So he's like, this sounds like a terrible idea. And he crosses. Yeah. So by this time, by the way, Crassus has died. So, think about a two-legged stool, guys who don't completely get along. Now it's Caesar and Pompey. Pompey is on the side of the Senate. So what this means is that neither Pompey or Caesar are good guys. They're both basically in it for themselves. Neither one is particularly committed to the Republic. But what does that mean for people who are ardent supporters of the Republic, like Cato or like Cicero? It means that they have to decide what side they're going to take. And at first, both of them are neutral. Both of them are like, sort of like some people are like this with our contemporary politics. They're like, Democrats, Republicans are both dirty, both equally involved in taking money from these people. I don't know who I would vote for. You hear this sort of thing. Cicero and Cato were in a situation like that. But eventually they decide for Pompey's side because Pompey is at least supporting the Republic. He's at least not disbanding the Senate or disregarding their orders. And they bet on the wrong horse because turns out Caesar is a much better military commander than anybody else around, and he beats them. And what ends up happening? Cato, he withdraws to North Africa, and he's really the last of the resistance there. But eventually he commits suicide when it becomes clear that there's no way to win, and his troops wind up being executed by Caesar, which is a very strange move on Caesar's part, because usually Caesar's all about clemency. Caesar does grant clemency to Cicero, but now Cicero's totally out of things. He has no political stake. He's lucky that he's got anything. And this is when he does a lot of his writing. Then what happens? How long does Caesar rule? As dictator. Imperator. Not long, right?
Yeah.
There's a conspiracy against him. Cicero was not in on the conspiracy, and we know this because there's a letter where he says, I wish I'd been in on the conspiracy, because that SOB Caesar really had it coming to him. He didn't say it in those words, of course, it's said much better than that. But that's what ends up happening. And then, once again, you've got social chaos, right? And there's a struggle now between Mark Antony, who's Caesar's essentially right-hand man, his successor in a certain way, and Octavian, who's supposed to be, by Caesar's will, Caesar's successor, and they get into some fighting with each other, right? And what ends up happening is Octavian occupies Rome, and eventually he comes to terms with Mark Antony and this guy Lepidus, and they form a third triumvirate. Now, one of the problems with that is they come up with a list, like I put on here, for proscriptions. And proscriptions mean this is a death list. You're an enemy. And so they put senators and members of the equestrian class on that. Cicero and his son are both on that list. And actually, some people try to get him off of that list, and Antony won't budge. And Cicero is apprehended outside of this place called Formia. He's leaving, trying to get to Greece, and he's beheaded. And they bring his head, and some accounts say his right hand, some say both hands, back to Rome, and nail them to the walls for public display. And that's the end of Cicero and his political involvements. And what happens after that? We know that the thing breaks down. Octavian becomes the Caesar Augustus. And now we've got an empire. So Cicero is there, and he's intimately involved while the Roman Republic is falling apart. He plays a role in it. He plays a losing role, but he takes the good side in many respects. Pompey takes the good side, but only because Pompey, doesn't want Caesar to win, and he it's not as if he had a real love for the Roman Republic. Cicero, Cato, people like that, they were, real partisans of that form of government. They thought that it was an important part of Roman liberty. And this is part of why he's so influential today. Before I go into any of that stuff, though, any questions? I've given you a very long story about what happened with these crazy Romans and their civil wars and social wars and, proscriptions and a lot of bloodletting, a lot of rivalry, No? Well, let's talk then about something more sedate, something more intellectual. Cicero, he wasn't the only person to write stuff down or to be a philosopher. Cato was a Stoic. Didn't write, as far as we know, but he's actually a character in Cicero's dialogues. Caesar, of course, writes a wonderful piece of propaganda that first-year Latin students often have to read, the Gallic Wars, right? Basically, he's the hero in the story.
He writes of himself as the third person.
Yeah, well, he was thinking ahead, so to speak, right? A lot of these guys are very well educated, and Cicero is particularly so. He got to study with some of the heads or best representatives of various schools of philosophy. There were 5 main schools of philosophy in the ancient world by the time that Cicero's around. One of them is a little bit defunct, and that's what I gave you the second handout for. I thought it could be useful just to keep track of all these different things. And you notice that most of them actually come from Socrates. So you have the Platonic Academy, right? Plato, probably Socrates' most famous student. He starts this academy. He's got his own philosophy called Platonism, of course, because it's Plato's thing, just like Aristotelianism or the Peripatetic school. It's going to be another offshoot. But then we have these other interesting schools, the Stoics, the Skeptical Academy, because Plato's academy is going to take a skeptical turn, and the Epicureans. And each of these has its own sort of take on what the good life is, what human beings are, whether we should be politically involved or not, what the cosmos is, what the goal of human life is, how we can be certain or not certain about things, what everything is made of. These schools, they all write long treatises, much of which we've lost, except for Plato and Aristotle's stuff, unfortunately. But we know from this guy Diogenes Laertes, he's given us lists of titles of books that we don't have. So the Stoic school, we probably have maybe 10% of what was written at best, mostly from later authors who've been preserved. Epicurus, we have, he was one of the most prolific authors in antiquity. We have 3 letters and 2 summaries of doctrine. And part of that is because Diogenes Laertes actually copied these out by hand himself. If he hadn't done that, we'd have almost nothing. Cicero was able to study this stuff at the source. He read Greek. He could interact with the Greeks. He was over there. So he comes back to Rome. And part of his mission is to create, to improve Roman culture. So I thought I would actually read you something from one of his books. This is called the Definibus, or it's usually translated as On the Ends. And Cicero begins it. It's a dialogue, and he's got people talking back and forth. And he says, a lot of people say I shouldn't be writing in Latin. He says, The following essay, attempting as it does to present in a Latin dress subjects that philosophers of consummate ability and profound learning have already handled in Greek, is sure to encounter criticism from different quarters. Some people say, you can't do philosophy in Latin. It's just not a language designed for that. Greek is where it is. If you're going to do philosophy, you can't even really talk about it in Latin. You just got to talk Greek. Sort of like you see people today who are a little pretentious, and they're like, you can't understand Jean-Paul Sartre in English translation. You have to read it in the French. And, there's a certain je ne sais quoi to it, which basically just means I don't know, right? Or people do this, especially with German stuff. Oh, you can't understand Heidegger in English or Hegel in English. You have to read it in the German. And when you talk about it in English, you have to throw in a lot of German words. So we can't, or Nietzsche, we can't call it the overman or the superman. It must be the Übermensch. And if we don't say that, we're not really doing philosophy. So there were a lot of people at that time saying stuff like that, which just goes to show us pretentious people exist everywhere and at all times, right? So he goes on and he says, I should make some reply to these criticisms. So he says that, here we go. What astonishes me about those who have a contempt for Latin writings is why should they dislike their native language for serious and important subjects when they're quite willing to read Latin plays translated word for word from the Greek? So they're saying, listen, you do this in other genres. Why do you think philosophy is so tricky this way? And he goes on and he says, my goal is ultimately to allow philosophy to speak in Latin. And he did it. Because area of philosophy after area of philosophy, whether it's metaphysics, what we call epistemology, or sort of study of how we get to know things, what is truth, ethics, political philosophy, logic, all these sorts of things, he does it. He pulls it off. And the way that he pulls it off is usually by having a dialogue. And you could say, here's sort of the typical Ciceronian thing. An Epicurean, a Stoic, and an Aristotelian walk into a bar. Except it's not a bar, it's a library. And they're usually talking about, this reminds me of this thing that happened at this time. Oh, tell me about that. And what were their doctrines? And then he goes into it. And what's really cool about it, though, is that not only does he have these people present the positions, he has them argue with each other and say, I think that's wrong. That doesn't make sense at all. You guys, say this sort of thing, but that's just nonsense. They make criticisms. They analyze each other's arguments. And in the process, Cicero often doesn't tell you what side he's actually on. And he's good enough with it that you're getting a decent Epicurean position, a decent Stoic position, and you can kind of pick and choose. And a lot of what we know about what these ancient schools taught comes to us from Cicero because of these characters. So, in his prefaces, I actually went through and I was looking at the ones that I have today just to sort of get a sense of the different things that he brings up. So, what we see in the prefaces is people engaged in intellectual debate and discussion, learning from each other. He also brings up another thing over and over again, unsurprisingly, which is that there are troubles within the Commonwealth, and he thinks that philosophy, and the other thing that he was particularly known for, oratory, or what we call rhetoric, would come to aid that. If we actually studied philosophy, we might be able to overcome these problems that we're having. And the third thing that he kept on stressing was that eloquence is a very great tool, and so is reasoning, so is philosophy. And we need both of these. Because eloquence without the moral guidance of philosophy turns into, mere salesmanship, let's call it, right? But philosophy without eloquence is pretty helpless. Can't get much done. He actually criticizes the Stoics, who he likes a lot. He says, you Stoics, the problem with you guys is you think that you're going to put the philosophy out there and everyone's going to look at it and go, oh, yeah, you're right. We should change what we're doing, right? You need to use a little bit of marketing, a little bit of salesmanship. And he says, I'll show you how to do that. And he writes a book called Stoic Paradoxes where he's actually doing that, just to show that it could be done. Another thing I'll mention, too, about Cicero and his view. So I mentioned that these are dialogues between different positions. And I did say that we sometimes can't tell where Cicero himself stands. That's because Cicero is an eclectic. When we use this term eclectic, I think most people today are used to thinking about it in terms of music or like furnishings. And what do we mean when we say, like, I have an eclectic taste in music, which I actually don't. I mostly listen to heavy metal and classical and a bit of hard rock. My wife has very eclectic taste. Those of you who know her, she listens to everything across the board. What does it mean to have eclectic tastes?
Mix.
Yeah, very, very good. So, what's that?
Like a wide variety.
Yeah, I mean, literally, it's picking a little bit of this and a little bit of this. That's the eclectane is taking in different things, and Cicero is doing that with philosophy. He says that he's a member of the Academy, which is the skeptical school of the time. But for somebody who's supposed to be a skeptic, he sure takes on a lot of Aristotelian and a lot of Stoic philosophy. And in one book, actually says, well, if I wasn't an academic, I would actually be a Stoic instead. And so he's really blending together different strains and saying, well, why would we throw out the baby with the bathwater? Why would we say just because I belong to this school, I can't take on things from other schools if they've got things right? The other thing that I really like about Cicero is that he stresses that the life of philosophy should not be a purely intellectual life. As a matter of fact, he would probably look at most philosophy professors and say, you guys are failing in your calling. He thought that you needed to be actively engaged in your community. And he actually faults Plato himself for giving people a pass for not being involved in just doing philosophy. He says, Plato's right. They're usually pretty harmless. If you're just studying philosophy, at least you're not like robbing your neighbor or getting involved in political tiffs or stuff like that. But you're not actually doing any active good. You're not resisting evil when it takes place. You're not trying to further justice. He thought this was very important. Cicero himself could have retired and not been involved in Roman politics, but he does get involved. And I think that's an expression of how he viewed philosophy. Philosophy needs to be something that really commits a person to what they call the active life, not just the contemplative life. The other thing that I'll say that's quite remarkable, Cicero was what you call a virtue ethicist. And virtue ethicists would be, the Stoics, Aristotle, Plato. They think that there's, things like justice or courage or temperance, and we ought to possess these traits, and we should try to get away from the vices which are opposed to them, and that's what makes us good people. So if we want to realize what it is to be a human being, we need to try to cultivate wisdom or try to cultivate generosity or whatever the other virtues are. Cicero says that's all true, but we want to be realistic about this. The Stoics sometimes, and even Aristotle, would set the bar so high it seemed like nobody could really meet it. That's not helpful for us. If we want to try to figure out how to become better people in, say, our relationships and our job, in our actual lives that we live, we need to look at examples of people that we know that have these traits. And they're not perfect, but they're pretty good. They're better than us. We can look up to them and say, that guy still loses his temper, but he's a hell of a lot better off than I am with respect to the emotion of anger. Or that guy is, not just all the time, but he's, a lot better off than I am. And so he says we should do that. We should pick examples that we can actually relate to, not some, totally high up there. We have no way of comparing ourselves to this perfectly wise person who's almost, like semi-divine. We don't have to worry about that sort of stuff. And when we look down towards others who are not as far advanced, we should recognize, he says, whatever outlines, whatever vestiges, whatever tendencies of virtue they have in them, and try to cultivate that. Instead of saying, well, you're not measuring up to this, so everything you do is crap. We should say, oh, wow, so most of the time you're a coward, but you're actually showing a little bit of courage here. I'm going to encourage that, and maybe next time it won't be, you won't have to jump through so many hoops in order to do the right thing. That's the sort of thing that Cicero advocated. He's not saying give everybody a pass and, or as we say, give everybody a gold star, but he is saying that we have to be very realistic in what we expect of people, how we measure ourselves, and in the ideals that we pick. So that's a lot, of stuff about intellectual life. I should pause for just a moment. Any questions or comments that spark any thoughts? Anything that we've talked about before that you want to go back to, or? If not, I'll jump right into his influence, which has been pretty significant. Less in the last 2 centuries than pretty much since he died at any other point in time. Even in his own lifetime, he was considered a very important person. And you see Plutarch, including him in the Parallel Lives. Quintilian, very important teacher of rhetoric, said that Cicero was not the name of a man, but of eloquence itself. So that's, pretty high praise right there, and a good turn of phrase for a rhetorician. Has a lot of influence on early Christianity. I'll give you just a couple examples. So Augustine said that he was converted to Christianity in part by some of Cicero's writings. Unfortunately, those are lost. So we don't have those. As a matter of fact, some of the texts that we have are fragmentary. Jerome, who was over in Palestine, one of the early church doctors, he liked Cicero so much that he actually had a dream, or a vision perhaps, where he was being accused of loving Cicero more than the Gospels. And he was sort of like somebody who, maybe they like watching TV too much or exercising too much. He's like, I guess I have to back off on the Cicero because it's just too wonderful. Because I'm supposed to be focused on the Gospels. So that tells you, quite a bit. His book, On Duties, or De Officiis, that will provide a model for a lot of Christian writings. Similarly, Ambrose has On the Offices of People in the Church. It's essentially sort of Christianizing on duties. There's a lot of things going on like that. And he would have an influence on, not just Augustine, but Boethius, Isidore of Seville, a very important sort of encyclopedist, Alcuin, who's a person who's part of the Carolingian Renaissance, trying to sort of reconstitute learning in Europe. Learning for them in some part means Cicero. And the monks copied Cicero's texts because they thought this stuff is worth preserving. As a matter of fact, are you guys familiar with this notion of the virtuous pagan? Is this something, did anyone go to Catholic school and get this drilled into their head? So the virtuous pagans, this is how you deal with the problem that comes up in Christian theology. Before Christianity comes, people are kind of screwed. They don't have the gospel. How are they going to be saved? There's the Jewish people, and they can be taken care of in this way. But what about like Socrates? Wasn't he a good guy? Why does he have to go to hell? Well, one of the answers for that is he doesn't have to. We'll find another place for them, for these virtuous pagans, right? These people who are doing the right thing. And there's other ways to get around this. Clement of Alexandria actually said Greek philosophy functions like the Old Testament did for the Jews. It works that way for the Greeks. It's a preparation for the gospel. There's a lot of ways to handle this. But Cicero gets counted as one of those virtuous pagans. And probably, within that framework, it makes sense. So that goes on, and they're continuing to copy his works, what they have of them, sometimes losing them in the process in these monastery libraries. He also plays a very important role in sort of giving the medievals things to think about in terms of natural law, rights, duties. That plays an important role. His works are read to study rhetoric, so those are continuing on. Unfortunately, they tended to cite from a non-Ciceronian work that had been attributed to him, but that's quite all right. That happened a lot in the Middle Ages, that sort of thing. And Roman and medieval Christian writers also referenced some of his works in ways that have passed them down to us in fragments, which is kind of good. And then, in the Renaissance, Petrarch discovers these letters of Cicero. And it starts leading to not just looking for Cicero in monasteries, but looking to see what's in these monastery basement libraries where all these old manuscripts are. And so Cicero discovering his letters and saying, oh, this is cool stuff, let's make new copies of this, leads to the whole classicist movement within the Renaissance. That influences Erasmus, that influences Luther. Within later centuries, Cicero is going to be a big influence on John Locke, on Montesquieu, on David Hume, and through that he's going to influence the people who will eventually become our founding fathers in the United States. Cicero is widely read throughout the 18th century, and very highly respected. As a matter of fact, if you read somebody like David Hume, you would get the idea that Cicero is probably more important when it comes down to really thinking things out than Aristotle, who the schoolmen were all about, or Plato. Cicero is probably more on top of things. Now, why do things change? So I actually earmarked a portion of this introduction that, not in this one, in this one, that gives you a good sense for why they thought, you don't need to study Cicero anymore. This is a guy writing in an introduction to a Cicero book. So presumably he's got some, as they call it, skin in the game, right? He cares enough about Cicero to be translating him. Here's what Rackham, the translator, says. Alexander the Great died in 323, Aristotle in 322. Both Epicurus and Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, began to teach at Athens about 20 years later. The date marks a new era in Greek thought, as in Greek life. Speculative energy had exhausted itself. The schools of Plato and Aristotle showed little vigor after the death of their founders. Enlightenment had undermined religion, yet the philosophers seemed to agree about nothing except that things are not what they appear, and the plain man's distrust of their conclusions was raised into a system of skepticism by Pyrrho. And it goes on. And he ends up saying that, all of this is kind of second rate when it comes to philosophy. What about Cicero himself? Well, his work is interesting, but there's nothing really original about it. It's just kind of taking Greek ideas and gussying them up in Latin prose and putting them in people's mouths. And so, really, if it was lost forever, it wouldn't be a great loss. It's not, like the greats in philosophy. And that was a very common conception, I would say, in the 19th century. They thought that, with the decline of the Greek city-state, that Greek philosophy itself had lost its way. And I think they were kind of careless readers of Greek philosophy and Roman philosophy. And then that carried through the 20th century. Even in a lot of, among classicists and people who do know ancient philosophy, many of them just dismissed everything after Plato and Aristotle. When we read the stuff, though, what we find is there's a lot of really fascinating stuff there. Within the Stoic school, within the skeptics, the Epicureans, eclectics like Cicero, later Platonists like Plutarch. People read Plutarch's biographies, but Plutarch, about half of his work is actually philosophy that he wrote himself in the Platonist tradition. Very interesting stuff. All sorts of other interesting stuff all along the way. And this has been recognized more and more, I would say, over the last 50 years And so it's reached the point where I'd say Cicero is kind of on the rise. The other thing that I think plays a major role in that is the revival of interest, not among academics so much, but among ordinary people in Stoicism. Because with the Stoics, I mentioned we only have about maybe 10% tops of what they wrote in antiquity. A lot of the rest has been just lost. Although we have tantalizing titles, we wish we could read these books because they sound so interesting. We have Seneca. That's the bulk of what we've got. We have Epictetus. We have Epictetus' teacher, Musonius Rufus. We have Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor, his meditations. And then if we want to know more systematically about Stoicism, this is the guy that we have to go to, Cicero. Because the speeches or the summaries that he gives of Stoicism tell us a lot about that, even though he wasn't a Stoic. So there's been a revival of interest in Cicero because of that. Later on, next month, I'll be going to the Ciceronian Society to present a paper on Cicero. The fact that there is a society at least tells you that there's some interest out there. This is an academic one more than a practical one, but there's some interest out there in this guy Cicero. And I think he's a fascinating figure. What we see here is somebody who's an intellectual, but he really did live the practical life. How many intellectuals can you say that about? Where they are involved, just literally a heartbeat away from, the rule or power of their country. And in his case, it wasn't just his country. It was essentially civilization in the West, The Romans were positioning themselves that way. He knew all these ancient schools. He bequeaths us this legacy that helps us understand them. How many people can we say that about? I mean, I don't want to deify him. He had his bad points in some cases. People faulted him for getting depressed when he was exiled. I'd probably get depressed if I was exiled. They took my house away. But on the whole, maybe he should have resisted Caesar earlier on, but it's very easy to make those sort of second-guessing things. So what we have here is a fascinating figure. Hopefully, now you've got a better sense of how his history forms him and what his role then is in shaping history. And I would say that he probably shaped history more than history shaped him on the whole. Again, something we probably can't say that much about for most intellectuals.